Deadwood, South Dakota, the Wild West city that had no real law. A poker table in Deadwood, the 2nd of August, 1876. A man crosses the floor, steps in behind the most famous gunfighter in the West, and shoots him in the back of the head. The killer is caught within the hour, and then a court lets him walk. It lets him walk because this town was not legally allowed to exist at all, and that one fact explains everything wild about Deadwood. Subscribe and like before we go on. The law is about to come back, and you want to see how it does. Here is the whole story in 2 lines. Deadwood was the richest, wildest mining camp in the American West, and it had no real law for one reason. The entire town sat illegally on ground the United States had promised to the Lakota, so no legal court could be placed there at all. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the summer of 1874. A military column under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer rode into the Black Hills of what is now South Dakota. Officially, it was a survey. In practice, the expedition came back out talking about gold. Newspapers ran the word across the country, and the word was enough. There was only one problem, and it was a serious one. The Black Hills were not open land. By the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, signed only 6 years earlier, the United States had guaranteed the hills to the Lakota as part of the Great Sioux Reservation. The treaty was a federal document with the force of law. It said, in plain terms, that this country belonged to the tribes, and that white settlers had no right to it. So when miners began pouring in through 1875 and into 1876, every one of them was a trespasser. The army was actually ordered for a while to turn the prospectors back. It could not hold the line. By the spring of 1876, there were thousands of people packed into a narrow gulch, throwing up a town of saloons, tents, and plank storefronts along a single muddy street. And this is the part that makes Deadwood different from every other rough camp you have heard about. A normal frontier town, even a violent one, has a legal skeleton underneath it. There is a county, a court, a judge somewhere with real authority. Deadwood had none of that because it could not. The United States could not appoint a marshal or open a courtroom on land it had sworn by treaty belonged to someone else. To do so would be to admit the whole settlement was legitimate, and legally it was the opposite of legitimate. So the camp governed itself. When men needed a decision, they held what they called a miners' meeting, a rough assembly that voted on claims, settled disputes, and now and then judged a crime. It was order of a kind. It was not law. There was no power behind it that any court in the country would recognize. A place with that much gold and no law was bound to draw a certain kind of man, and in the summer of 1876, it drew the most famous gunfighter alive. He came to Deadwood to gamble. He would be dead within weeks, shot in the back at a card table, and the way the town handled his killing would expose the whole hollow machine for exactly what it was. His name was James Butler Hickok. Though by 1876 almost no one called him that, they called him Wild Bill. He was the closest thing the frontier had to a living legend, a former lawman, scout, and gambler whose reputation as a pistol shot had been printed and reprinted in the Eastern papers until it ran far ahead of the man himself. And that is the first thing the records correct. The Wild Bill who rode into Deadwood was not the figure from the dime novels. He was about 39 years old, and he was fading. His eyesight, by several accounts, was failing, possibly from glaucoma or an infection, and for a man whose whole reputation rested on seeing and shooting first, that was a quiet catastrophe. His best years as a gunfighter were behind him. He had married earlier that year, and he had come to the Black Hills like everyone else, chasing money. But Hickok was not swinging a pick. He made his living at the poker table. He had every reason to be careful. Hickok had spent years as a marshal in the Kansas cattle towns, in places like Hays City and Abilene, and he had made enemies the way that work makes enemies. He knew that a man with his name was worth killing, that somewhere there was always someone who wanted to be known as the one who shot Wild Bill. So he had a habit. He sat with his back to the wall. He kept the room in front of him. In a town with no police, your own caution was the only protection you had, and Hickok's caution had kept him alive a long time. On the 2nd of August, 1876, that habit failed him. He walked into a saloon, Nuttall and Mann's number 10, and joined a poker game already in progress. The only open seat left him with his back to the door. By the accounts that survive, he asked another player to switch with him, and the man refused, and Hickok let it go. He sat down facing the wrong way. While he played, a man named Jack McCall drifted into the saloon. McCall was a nobody, a drifter and sometime buffalo hunter in his mid-20s, the kind of man no one in the room would have watched twice. He moved up behind Hickok, drew a pistol, and shot him once in the back of the head at point-blank range. Hickok died at the table without ever turning around. Here is where legend takes over from the record, and it is worth being honest about the scene. The story goes that when Hickok fell, the cards in his hand spilled onto the table and showed 2 black aces and 2 black eights, and that ever since, that combination has been called the dead man's hand. It is a wonderful piece of frontier folklore. It is also exactly that. The earliest solid accounts of the killing do not agree on what cards he held, and the famous hand only became fixed in the story decades later. So treat it the way the camp itself would learn to treat the truth, as the popular version, told and retold until people stopped asking whether it was so. What is not in doubt is the speed of what came next. The whole point of Hickok's caution, the reason a careful man sat with his back to the wall, was that in a place like Deadwood there was no one whose job it was to protect you, and no one whose job it was to answer for your death. The most famous gunfighter in the West had just been murdered in front of a room full of witnesses, and now the camp faced a question it had no real ability to answer. McCall was grabbed almost at once. He had not even fled far. So the town had a killer in hand, a body cooling at the card table, and not one shred of legal power to put a man on trial. What do you do with a murderer when you are not allowed to have a court? They built one anyway. That is the remarkable thing about Deadwood in the days after the killing. Faced with a crime everyone had seen, the camp did not collapse into a mob. It reached for the closest thing it knew to order. The men of the Gulch called a miners' meeting and turned it into a court. Think about what that actually means. Because it is the whole story of frontier justice in miniature. There was no statute behind this court. No territory had authorized it. No judge held a commission. The men simply agreed among themselves that they would behave as if they had the power to try Jack McCall, and they put on the forms of a real trial without any of the substance underneath. They chose a man to act as judge. They picked a jury out of the crowd. They found someone to speak for the prosecution and someone to speak for the accused. From the outside, it would have looked like a courtroom. It was a kind of theater built out of necessity, a camp pretending into being the thing the law would not give it. The trial ran the next day, the 3rd of August. The case against McCall should have been simple. He had shot an unarmed man in the back of the head in front of witnesses, and he had not really denied it. But McCall gave the court a reason, and the reason is where the whole thing turned. He claimed that Wild Bill Hickok had killed his brother back in Kansas, and that he had shot Hickok in revenge. He named the brother. He told a story of a wronged family and a debt of blood. There was no evidence for any of it. As far as the records ever showed, Jack McCall had no such brother, and Hickok had killed no one of that name. The story appears to have been invented on the spot. But it did not need to be true, it only needed to land. And it landed, for reasons that had very little to do with justice. Some in the camp may have half believed it. Others simply did not feel that the death of a famous gunfighter, a man who had killed before, was worth hanging a stranger over. There is a darker reading that some historians raise as well. That money or sympathy moved quietly through the jury. That the outcome was arranged before a word was spoken. We cannot prove what was in those men's minds. What we know is the verdict. The miners' jury found Jack McCall not guilty. He walked out free. A man who had committed an open murder in front of a saloon full of people was acquitted within a day and turned loose into the same streets. Now, if Deadwood had been a normal town with a normal court, that would have been the end of it. In American law, there is a powerful principle that a man cannot be tried twice for the same crime. Once a real court acquits you, the government cannot come back for another try. McCall, in theory, should have been protected by exactly that rule for the rest of his life. Except the rule only works if the first court was real. And this is the hinge the entire story has been turning toward. Because Deadwood sat on treaty land where the United States held no legal authority, the miners' court was not a court at all in the eyes of the law. It had no jurisdiction, it had no standing. And a verdict from a body that was never a court protects no one. Because in the law's eyes, nothing happened there at all. The acquittal that should have saved Jack McCall was legally thin air. McCall did not understand that few men in the Gulch would have. He left Deadwood not long after, riding out a free man, and by several accounts he could not keep quiet about it. He talked. He bragged about the killing in saloons, and in doing so, he made the one mistake that the legal vacuum of Deadwood could not protect him from. He drifted out of the lawless hills and into territory where the real law of the United States actually reached the ground. That territory was Yankton, far to the southeast, the capital of Dakota Territory and the seat of its real courts. This was United States soil in the full legal sense, with a federal judge, a marshal, and the whole machinery that Deadwood lacked. And here McCall's bragging caught up with him. A deputy United States marshal arrested him, and the federal authorities began to build a case. The argument they made is the cleanest illustration of the whole point of this story. McCall protested, of course, that he had already been tried for the Hickok killing and found not guilty, and that the law could not touch him twice. The prosecution answered with the fact that had been hiding underneath Deadwood from the day it was founded. The miners' court had no legal existence. It had been convened on land where the United States held no jurisdiction, by men with no authority to judge anyone. Therefore, the first trial was void. It was not a flawed trial or an unfair trial. In law, it was no trial at all, and a man cannot claim the protection of a verdict that never legally happened. The court accepted it. McCall would be tried again, and this time in a real federal courtroom in front of a real judge, by the actual law of the United States. The retrial was a different creature from the show in Deadwood. The revenge story that had saved him in the Gulch fell apart under real examination. There was no murdered brother. There was only a man who had walked up behind another man and shot him in the back of the head. In December of 1876, the federal jury convicted Jack McCall of murder. On the 1st of March, 1877, he was hanged at Yankton, and by some accounts he was buried with the noose still around his neck stop. And look at what just happened. Because it is the proof of everything we started with. The exact same crime produced two opposite outcomes. In Deadwood, where there was no law, the killer of the most famous gunfighter in the West walked free in a single day. In Yankton, a few months later and a few hundred miles away, the same man for the same act went to the gallows. Nothing about the murder changed between those two verdicts. The only thing that changed was whether the ground underneath the courtroom was legally American. That is the difference law makes, drawn in the sharpest line you will ever see. And here is the part that ties the man's fate to the town's. The very thing that had made Deadwood lawless, the treaty that locked the United States out of the Black Hills, was about to be torn up. While McCall was being tried and hanged, the government was finishing the job of taking the hills for good. After the fighting of 1876, the same summer Hickok died, the United States pushed a new agreement on the Lakota under brutal pressure, cutting their rations until the leaders signed. By the Act of February of 1877, the Black Hills were stripped out of the Great Sioux Reservation and declared open. It was a hard taking, and by the treaty's own terms a deeply questionable one, but its effect on Deadwood was immediate. The ground was now, in the government's eyes, legally American, and the moment it was, the law could finally come in. It came in the shape of men like Seth Bullock. Bullock had arrived in Deadwood in 1876, the same year as Hickok. But he was a very different sort of figure. A former territorial lawmaker out of Montana who came to the camp to sell hardware and to build something that would last. In 1877, as the hills became legal ground, Bullock was appointed the first sheriff of the new Lawrence County. He was not a fast gun out of a legend. He was an administrator, a merchant, a man who understood that a town survives on order and not on reputation. Under men like him, Deadwood began the slow turn from an outlaw gulch into a governed town with a real court behind it. The wildness did not end with a gunfight, it ended with a deed. Which brings us back to the question we started with. How could a town let the murderer of Wild Bill Hickok walk free? And what finally made it stop being wild? The easy answer, the one the movies have always reached for, is that the West was wild because the men in it were wild. Savages, the story goes, in a savage country, held in check only by the occasional brave lawman with a fast hand. Deadwood is held up as the perfect example. A town soaked in gold and gun smoke, lawless because its people were lawless by nature. The records tell a colder and far more interesting story. Deadwood was not wild because its people were uniquely violent. By the standards of the frontier, they were ordinary men chasing ordinary things, money, acclaim, a fresh start. Deadwood was wild because the law was legally locked out, not absent because no one had gotten around to it. Lock it out, on purpose, by a treaty the United States had signed and by its own inability to govern land it had promised away. Take away the courts. The jurisdiction, the power to make a verdict means something, and even decent men will reach for minors' meetings and revenge stories, because something has to fill the space where the law should be. And the proof is in how fast it changed. The same town that turned a murderer loose in a single day in 1876 was, within a couple of years, a place with a sheriff, a county, and courts whose verdicts actually held. The men did not suddenly become tame. The fast guns did not all ride off. What changed was the one thing underneath everything else. The ground became legal, and the law was allowed in. Jack McCall is that whole lesson in one man. The same crime, the same killer, free in the Gulch and hanged in Yankton, and the only thing that moved between the two was whether the floor beneath the court was American soil. So the next time you hear Deadwood called the wildest town in the West, remember what was really wild about it. It was not the gold, and it was not the gunfighters. It was a settlement that was never supposed to exist, built on borrowed ground, running on a kind of order that no court in the country would recognize. The lawlessness of Deadwood was never a flaw in the character of the West. It was a hole in the map, a place where the law had been told it could not stand. And into that hole rushed everything the legend remembers. The wonder is not that Wild Bill Hickok was murdered there, and his killer walked. The wonder is how little it finally took to end it. Just a line redrawn on legal ground, and the whole wild thing quietly came to a close.